This story begins with Duke Staten coming to meet a girl in order to marry her. Girl was in his mansion and did not know what to expect from this meeting, for she had never seen this man before. This girl's name is Nadia Messier. She's the daughter of Baron Lancaster. When she was informed that someone had come to see her, she didn't know how to behave in the situation. She was very curious to understand why he had chosen to marry a girl from the Baron's family. She could not have dreamed of such a fate as her family did. When her brother tried to explain that they couldn't just let their only sister go, the man replied that Nadia should have gotten a fiancé a long time ago. If the girl were from some duke's family, she'd have the courage to refuse. But unfortunately, or fortunately, with such a formidable opponent, she couldn't do that, and apparently she's going to have to take him up on his offer. The Duke is a 2-meter-tall beast, and worst of all, he can easily destroy whoever he sees fit. And now the Duke, about whom such rumors are circulating, has chosen Nadia, though they have never seen each other, nor known each other. The girl did not imagine how this man would be her future husband, and what relations between them could be, for they were quite different people. As Nadia waited for him in the room, she tried in every way to think out what she would say to him, and what she would talk to him about. As suddenly, it was too late and he walks right up to her room, the sound of his footsteps making her anxious. As he was considered a real villain, Nadia felt very uncomfortable, for she was afraid of some bad consequences in case he did not like anything. When Staten first walked in, his silhouette seemed just huge and a little intimidating. For the first few seconds, the girl tried not to look at him so she wouldn't be scared, and act like she wasn't afraid of him, because if he realized that, he might get angry, and what would happen next, one can only assume. Nadia was not the kind of person who liked to risk angering people like that. But since the girl had agreed some time ago to seek him out as a wife, the guy had every right to communicate with the girl at any time. As he approached, Nadia tried to calm herself, for it was very difficult to concentrate at the sight of such a rumored man, so much so that she even closed her eyes. At that moment, it seemed to her that he had some bad intentions, and since she didn't refuse his offer, there's nowhere else to go. So the girl opened one eye to get a slight glimpse of his appearance, and as it turned out, it wasn't easy at all. Plus, the room was a little dark, and because of his hair, it was impossible to look at his face and see his eyes. Her husband did have a memorable and striking appearance that took some getting used to. This man is over 2 meters tall, his clothes are all black, and also, what the girl noticed first, he has a lot of black-colored hair, and also the beard, which gave that most unusual look. Unlike the other guys, he looked quite different from most of the. And suddenly, Staten finally showed his eyes, and the girl saw the look in his eyes, who was initially very intimidated. It's hard to imagine how Nadia will react when Staten talks to her. For one glance from him made her nervous and anxious, and then the girl remembered that she was by no means to show her fear, because you don't know how he's going to react to it, because most likely he's not going to like it. At this point, she started to hiccup, and then she immediately began to think of ways to get rid of it. Clamping her nose was rude. Drinking water. Unfortunately, she wasn't around. Besides, it was very strange when the girl felt a sense of fear, because at the moment, he hadn't said a single word yet, and in the meantime, Nadia had made up her own mind that he had bad intentions. And when the Duke was silent, it was even worse for her, for she thought that if he was silent, it meant he was very angry, and perhaps did not want to show it. It got to the point where the girl thought the Duke might get angry, and ask how she dared hiccup in his presence, or accuse her parents of not raising her properly. It wouldn't be surprising if he didn't really think anything of the sort, or even plan to scare her in any way on the first day of the wedding. All this time, neither of them has said a single word, and apparently the girl is definitely not ready for it yet. She is afraid to say something, and at the same time, that he will start to say something to her, or ask her something. At that moment she had only one wish, to turn back the clock and not accept his proposal, to marry him, and also, if possible, to get away from him as soon as possible. As suddenly he started shouting loudly at her, but the girl didn't realize if he was really that angry with her, and he's about to start screaming, but it turns out a bottle was falling from the top shelf, and to avoid hitting the girl, he asked her to step back. Since Nadia didn't have time to react in this situation, she thought it was too late. When suddenly, Staten decided to take care of her himself, so that the girl wouldn't get bumped, at which point he went over to her and tried to protect her like a real man. By some miracle, he managed to catch that bottle and thus save his wife, though initially, Nadia immediately thought of him getting mad at her, and so he started yelling. But even this act of his did not convince the girl that he was not to be feared. This is what the Duke saw at this moment, and what she saw was an intimidating look that scared her very much, though it was probably only because of his unusual appearance, which she still wasn't used to. And then she couldn't help herself, and she started screaming really loud, and of course this scream was heard by all the helpers who were in the adjoining rooms. They were very much surprised, and did not know what could have happened. When some guy asked what it was, the girls immediately started telling him it was probably Nadia, because there was a scream from the Duchess's room. So Duke Statton's senior aide, Jade Allen, immediately decided to go there to find out what had happened, because someone might need help. A few minutes later, he had already approached the right room, and warned the Duke that he had come to check and find out the cause of the scream. And after that, he asked to come in, because it was his duty to supervise everything, and in case of what happened, to deal with the situation. But at that moment, surprisingly, the door was open, and he was easily able to see what was going on in that room. But what he saw there surprised him very much, for he had not expected that something like this could happen. At first glance, it seemed like something terrible had happened, although the guy doesn't know that in fact, nothing bad had actually happened. He's probably already thinking that it's not what really happened, but he's understandable too, because he doesn't know what happened. Of course, in his eyes it looked very suspicious and even a little frightening, for it would have been impossible to think otherwise. But what was most surprising was that he remained calm, and did not seem shocked at what he saw. And in order not to anger the Duke, he decided to ask him one question. Did he cause the girl to faint? To which the Duke replied that he had gotten it right today, and in fact, he had done her no harm at all. No wonder the guy drew such conclusions, since he knew the Duke was the real villain. After that, they decided to leave the room and talk it over. When Statton told his assistant what had really happened, he managed to change his mind, and Jade realized that the Duke wasn't guilty of anything, and afterwards said that the Duchess was also understandable. After all, she had married someone she knew nothing about but his name. And besides, Statton Grand Duke, of course it was no wonder she was stressed out. When suddenly, Jade told him that she was unconscious after all. Apparently thanks to the Duke, which was very suspicious, even though he had already explained everything to him. Statton was very angry, because he wanted to prove that he wasn't guilty of anything, and he wasn't trying to scare her. Even though the assistant trusted him, in this situation, it was very hard for him to believe that the girl had fainted not because of him, and that there was some other reason for it. And when the Duke realized that he might have been the cause of the girl's illness, he decided to ask, was Nadia so frightened by this acquaintance that she fainted at the first meeting, just because she was so scared when she saw her husband? The Duke asked his assistant if he looked that scary. In fact, he wasn't always the way he is now. Once, many years ago, when he was not so grown up, a very unpleasant situation occurred. The Duchess of Statton was kidnapped by some men, and the Duke tried to rescue her, but unfortunately it didn't work out, and it was very hard for the boy to lose his mom at that age. And at that moment, he was approached by his grandfather, who wanted to tell him something very important that he should understand at such a young age. The thing is, he was Statton's only receiver left, so if they lose him, their whole family will be in a lot of trouble. And also, since then, his grandfather has personally taken over his education, and as it turns out, it was his grandfather who insisted that his grandson be a beast, not a wimp. And it's since then that the boy has done everything to look the way he looks, and who he is now. As suddenly, his assistant asked, asking him if he was scary, waiting for an objective assessment, to which the Duke replied to tell him the truth. The moment has come when the boy will tell him the truth, and the Duke will realize how the people around him see him, that he looks like a bear on his hind legs. When Luke Statton heard that, he certainly didn't expect to look like that, and of course he got very angry, because no one would be happy to find out that he looked like a bear. Afterward, the guy asked if Luke hadn't forgiven Luke for answering him honestly, to which the Duke replied that his assistant had said the wrong thing, and that he doesn't care how others perceive him. But still, he would not want his wife to see him as a beast. The aide wondered if it mattered to the Duke, for he had never seen him so worried. Since a lot of girls liked Jade, he had a few tips that would help Luke Statton improve his relationship with Nadia, for he was sure that in every situation there was a way to make things right. But first he had to ask a few questions. First, what the Duke knew of Duchess Nadia, and what sort of person she was, for that was very important, in order to understand how he could help him. The assistant immediately realized that this question was too difficult, so he decided to lower the bar and asked if he even knew her name, to which the Duke replied that it was too easy, because her name is Nadia. Her name used to be Nadia Massieu, but now it's Nadia Staten because she's his wife at the moment. To which the aide asked how he could marry someone he had never seen or spoken to before. To which Luke Staten replied that he hadn't had time for it before. To which the aide said everything should have its own order. Because Nadia was so embarrassed when she first saw him, the aide thinks it shouldn't be every time she faints at the sight of him. And even though it was late, Jade advised him to take his wife to dinner, because that would do something to improve their relationship. And also, it would not hurt to hire a good barber and bring the beard in order. Give her something that will definitely like, well, and of course, tell her as many compliments as possible, and then the girl will definitely appreciate it. It was certainly a big responsibility for the Duke, but he knew he'd never be able to gain her trust without it, and Jade knew exactly what she was talking about. Luke Staten's first order of business is to find a good barber who can make him look more attractive, and because of this, instead of his wife being afraid of him, she will see how handsome he will become. When the Duke became convinced that it was really possible to make a difference in their relationship with his wife through appearance, he really thought about starting to change for the better. Besides, if a girl finds out that he made all those changes to please her, she'll definitely look at him differently and maybe change her mind. It turns out that 3 months ago, in the capital city of La Monstrode, the Duke had first listened to Leonard, who had suggested that he finally find a bride for himself. One day he walked up to him and saw Luke sitting there, sad for some reason. It was a very handsome guy who was the crown prince of the empire. His name is Leonard Modria. This fellow had often noticed that the Duke was more and more out of spirits, and he was very curious to know the cause of it, because it was impossible to watch Luke Staten being sad all the time, like he didn't know how to solve a problem. After all, before everything was completely different. He never looked so bad, and seeing him like this was very unusual. When they were growing up together in the capital, there were some very good times that they miss very much, and sometimes reminisce about. But then the Duke left for his estate, and it was like he'd been replaced. Leonard even suggested that maybe Luke wanted to go back, to which he replied that that's exactly what he was going to do. He was going to go back to his own homestead, because there was nothing for him to do here anyway. Leonard asked if he wouldn't visit him without a special invitation, to which Staten replied that he already came regularly for the anniversary of the founding of the empire, and didn't see what else they needed to do. To which Leonard asked, what about his birthday, since he was his only friend he wanted to see on this special day? The Duke was tired of answering these questions, and wished Leonard would go away as soon as possible. But unfortunately he can't tell the prince that. He hasn't promised to be loyal to him, but as a Duke, he's still obligated to serve him. Leonard keeps asking him about when he'll find a bride and introduce them to each other. When the prince had already definitely realized that the Duke was not going to stay in the capital, he asked him why there was no. He tried to persuade him not to go, but it was useless, for the Duke had already made up his mind, and he had no interest in staying here. Leonard tried to explain to him that he would be very bored, because leaving the capital was the wrong decision, and it would be much better to finally find himself a wife, to which the Duke asked what that had to do with it. Besides, the prince also doesn't have a fiancée, so he could advise thinking about it. To which the prince replied that he could get married at any time. He just hasn't met the girl who will be the best for him yet. And after that, said Luke has no reason to avoid it. As suddenly, he asked him another question. Is he really afraid of it? And thinks he won't be able to find someone he can fall in love with, and be in a good relationship with? Then the prince suggested that perhaps the Duke was in no hurry to find a bride for one reason only, because of the situation with his parents, which he still couldn't forget. And as the subject was not a pleasant or desirable one for him, the Duke tried to explain that he did not want to talk about it. And he also said that the Duchy of Staten would not go against the imperial family. Since they're on empire soil, they're part of it, so at any moment, he's ready to talk to the emperor. That is, the prince has nothing to worry about, because the Duke's family poses no threat to the imperial family, so there is no need to test his loyalty. It's not something you point out or say out loud, but in this situation it was necessary. La Monstrode's capital is as exquisite as a flower, and every night at the banquet his senses are dulled when he sees aristocrats who don't observe the basic rules of etiquette. So he's not very comfortable being there, and it seems that if he stays there any longer, there could be trouble. Because of the constant hints that it is time for him to get married and look for a bride, he wants to go away and not hear about it anymore, because he is tired of listening to someone's advice all the time. From these thoughts, his head spun sharply, and at that moment, a girl walked past him. Because of his appearance, he was hard to miss, and when this girl started to look at him, she got really scared. But Staten had long since gotten used to being startled by the sight of him and running away, so he didn't react. Since he was too sick to do so, the guy decided to stay in the same spot and get some rest. For this purpose, he chose a very cozy place near a tree, hoping that no one would find him there, and that he could be alone. But unfortunately, he didn't rest for long. Some girl came up to Staten. Apparently she was wondering why some guy was lying near a tree and resting. It turns out she thought the person was feeling sick, so she decided to come over and help if needed. The first thing she did was ask if he was okay, but Staten didn't even know what to say to her. It turned out that the girl had been watching him the whole time he was lying there, and she hadn't realized what had happened to him, because usually no one lies down to rest. Then she offered to help him, but Staten didn't respond for a long time. It was obvious that he didn't expect any help, especially not from such a beautiful girl, because usually he was afraid of everyone and ran away. Since he didn't answer her, she decided to ask him again, and at that moment, the sun's rays started hitting him. After that, it was very hard for him to open his eyes and look at her. Then another girl came up to them, because from the outside looking at him, it really looks like he needs help. They started to think about how to help him, and since he did not say anything and did not answer their questions, no one understood what had happened. Nadia did not understand what to do in this situation, as suddenly, another girl suggested to just leave, because she thought it was very dangerous to be near him. To which Nadia replied that she didn't understand how she could say such a thing, because you can't leave a person in such a state when he is unwell. Besides, she really decided that she wouldn't leave. It turns out that in this town, it is not customary to help strangers, much less pay attention to those around you. So Staten certainly didn't expect anyone to pay attention to him. And at this point, the guy notices that there are a lot of people gathered around them, all curious to know what happened, and of course he didn't like it. He was well aware of the thoughts of all these people, for they had stopped only to look or to tell their acquaintances what they had seen. But there was one very important point he didn't want to let happen, because if a doctor saw him and started examining him, it wouldn't be surprising that a few hours later the news would start writing about some bear lying on the floor, and then it turned out to be Duke of Staten. And among all these people, only Nadia was genuinely interested in his condition and wanted to help. It was really important for her to find out why he was lying in such a state in the street and not go to his room so that no one could see him and discuss him. After a while, Nadia begins to realize that she will never get any answer from him, so she tells him that the doctor will be here soon, and then they can figure out how to help him. And since the guy didn't want a doctor to visit him more than anything else, he still replied that it wasn't necessary and that he was feeling much better already. Nadia still did not believe him, and was sure that it was necessary to call a specialist, because it was obvious that no one would want to be examined by a doctor, and in such situations, everyone says that it is better, although in fact, it is not so. And to somehow explain why he was here, he said he just had a lot of problems, and because of that, he wanted to be alone. So he came to this place where he thought no one would notice him, and yet, thanks to this situation, the girl has finally spoken to him, and now, she's not so afraid to be in his presence. It's like she's really changed towards him, and it's very obvious. She doesn't have a scared look on her face or want to run away from him. During the conversation, the girl really became a different person, because at the first meeting, she was completely different. When Nadia gave him her handkerchief, Staten doubted whether he could accept it, or whether it would be better still to refuse it. As suddenly, they accidentally touched fingers, and the boy had a feeling that it might have been unpleasant for Nadia to do so, and apparently for that reason, to avoid seeing her displeased face, he decided to run away from her. He thought it would be better that way. Though it wasn't really necessary, Nadia didn't understand the act, for he didn't explain anything, and just ran away. She tried in every possible way to stop him, but unfortunately it was useless, for he was so intent on not looking wrong in her eyes that he didn't even think twice, and left her alone. No matter how much the girl screamed at him and tried to catch up, She couldn't. Apparently, Staten is very afraid of doing anything wrong that might offend or displease her. When he'd run away a bit and ended up somewhere else, the guy calmed down a bit, but how he'd explain it to her later was unclear. As the girl tried to stop him and called him sir, he immediately thought about it. Apparently, it was somehow unfamiliar to him, or he had never heard such a thing before. In fact, he really never heard such words towards himself from other people. Usually he is called a beast or a villain. Meanwhile, the doctor had already come to the girl, but when he saw that there was no one near her, it was hard for him to understand what was going on. In addition, Nadia still did not understand what had just happened, because usually run away from him, but not him. Apparently he was still a little ashamed of his act for not explaining anything, and leaving the girl in an unclear situation. At which point, Staten began to examine that handkerchief which the girl had given him. It showed everything very elegant with beautiful embroidery, and he also had thoughts that perhaps it was very expensive. It was a very good deed on her part. She showed what a kind and good person she is, although it was evident from the moment she approached the man who was just lying on the floor to offer her help. From that moment on, he had a slightly revised view of the kind of people who lived in the capital, for he had thought that everyone here was like his friend Leonard, who cared only for his own interests, and enjoyed his rights without knowing his duties. Unlike the people he spent all his childhood with, in that city, all the people were very kind and sincere, and it seemed to him that there were no more such people. And in cities, people do not know what love, support, help, and sincerity are. But today, his opinion has changed a lot, but not only about what kind of people live in this town, but also about his wife. Now he knows for sure that she is a very good and kind girl. And when he realized that when he thinks about Nadia, his heart starts beating really hard, which is a sign that he definitely likes her. Although when he starts to realize it, he tries not to think about it anymore, because he's afraid it's not mutual. Then, he turned his attention again to the very handkerchief with the incredibly beautiful embroidery. There were embroidered letters, namely, spelling her name. And since he didn't know her name before because she had never been able to introduce herself at their first meeting, he was very curious to know her real name. Afterward, when he regretted his act, Staten hoped that they might see each other again someday and talk things over properly, for it was surprising that at the first meeting she ran away, and at the second, the only thing he could think of was to ask her out and finally get to know her better. Meanwhile, Luke Staten decided to go home, because it was already dark outside, and there was no point in walking around at this hour. Afterward, he sat in a room with Leonard, and the latter asked him how he had gotten here, for it was a long walk to the imperial palace. If Luke had decided to stay in the capital and not return home, he had been too sure 3 days ago that there was nothing for him to do here. But it turns out that Staten returned to the imperial palace for a reason. He had a very important purpose, which concerned Nadia. He said that he had no one else to ask for advice, because the prince is very good with women and can tell him something. Apparently at this point, the prince doesn't even realize how serious the Duke is right now, and how much he needs to fix things with Nadia. Luke immediately asked what to do when the woman he loves shows up. He had not expected such questions in principle, and was not prepared to talk to the Duke on such subjects, for the Duke had never asked him about them. As suddenly, for some reason, the prince thought he had misunderstood him and had heard him ask him more than once, for he was sure the Duke would never have asked him such a thing. But to make sure the prince understood him correctly and heard exactly what he was telling him, Luke raised his voice a little and asked again what to do when the woman he loved showed up. And then the prince was definitely surprised, for he had never thought that he would ever talk about relations with girls with this person, who was not associated with love and tenderness. Then, the prince became very curious as to who this girl was, to which Staten replied that unfortunately he only knew her name, and that she was an angelic woman he admired every second of the day and fell in love with her at first sight, something he had never had in his entire life. As this is the first time the prince has heard such words from him, he found it very funny, and words like girl and love are something incompatible, in his opinion, to Luke Staten. And of course the Duke did not like it very much, because he was afraid and did not want exactly such a reaction. He became very offended, because he had just told him the whole truth, and the prince just exchanged he took his words seriously. And when the Duke inquired when he would stop laughing at him, and got no answer, Staten decided to repeat to him once more that it was really very important to him, and he was only required to give a little hint or advice. But for now, while the prince kept changing, the Duke asked what he should do now in this situation, for he had never had a girl before, and he himself would never be able to make things the right thing to do. After that, the prince definitely realized that he had to help him do something that would help him meet his beloved. But before he did, he asked him if the Duke didn't understand at all what he had to do in order to ask a girl for a date, to which Staten replied that he has never been interested in it, and his entire life and career has not been about girls and relationships. Thus, in all his 20 years, he has no idea how one should interact and spend time with them. But as the prince had no choice, he agreed to help him, for it was really not difficult for him to give some advice or suggest how best to behave on a date. But before giving any advice, he wondered for what purpose the Duke was going out with her. But Luke didn't understand what the prince meant by that, and didn't understand if there could be more than one reason or purpose for going out with a girl, to which the prince asked if he was going for a one-time outing, or to create a normal relationship, because a lot depends on it. If the Duke just wants to go out with her a few times, you have to behave a little differently than, for example, with a girl with whom he wants a serious relationship. Staten definitely wanted a good relationship, if that was possible, of course, and Nadia wouldn't mind, although after the recent situation, he doubted it very much. Leonard understood everything, and said that in this situation there is only one option that will definitely help him, to offer her to become his wife, because it is the only way to show the girl his seriousness. But the Duke was very surprised, for he did not think it was all that important. The prince asked him if he did not need it, and he wanted to love her, but not to take any responsibility for it. Staten didn't fully understand how he could do it, because the girl might not agree because she didn't even know who he was, and surely no one would agree to marry someone if nothing was known about the person. And suddenly, Leonard remembered what the Duke had said about her, that she was very beautiful, and there was no one better than her. So he assumed that maybe she already had a boyfriend or fiancé. But either way, there's no way they'll know until the Duke proposes, so he'll have to at least try, and then we can draw conclusions, judging by her response or reaction. And to calm him down a little, and not to make him think it would be some mistake, the prince tried to explain that even if Nadia refused him, it would be a very good reason to talk and see if there was any point in hoping for anything at all. And the prince had indeed succeeded in convincing him. The Duke was sure that this man knew what he was talking about, and if he didn't try, he would never know if he had a chance to be together with her. After that, Leonard decided to ask him what he was going to do, and if his advice had helped him, because if he really loved her, he'd have to talk to her about it anyway. Meanwhile, it's been 3 months. Luke Staten is at the Staten mansion. After all this time, Staten was sure he shouldn't have listened to anyone and taken this challenge, in the form of trying to suggest that Nadia should be in a relationship. But despite that, he was still happy with her when they got married quickly. But if he finds out it's not mutual, and his girlfriend doesn't feel the same way, he's going to be very hurt. And yet, he had gotten a little used to the way he should talk and behave around girls. With experience, he had really gotten the hang of it. As he was walking down the corridor, he met his former nanny, who is now the head maid. Her name is Anna, he asked her. What is Nadia's condition? To which she replied, and advised him to get in to see her soon, as the girl really needed it. It turns out she's in a very bad state that's kept her unconscious all day, and apparently she's getting worse and worse. So, he went to her first thing to check on her well-being, and see if there was anything he could do to help her in any way. When he went into her room, the doctor was there, trying all this time to improve her health and make her finally come to her senses and feel good about herself. But unfortunately, the doctor said there is no improvement, and she is not in the best condition right now. So they just have to wait and see if there will be any change for the better. It turned out that the girl had recently arrived from the capital, and the doctor suggested that perhaps this was the reason why she was feeling unwell now, and had not regained consciousness for several days. Because of the long journey, she lost a lot of strength. It was really very hard for her body to endure such a trip, because Nadia is not used to such a long journey. On account of this, having to endure such difficulties of health for want of strength, the Duke felt guilty, for he supposed that because she was very often anxious in his presence, It might also be the cause of all these troubles. As suddenly, he started to take the ring off his hand. Did he change his mind? And to make her feel good? He decided to just leave so as not to cause any more problems. The Duke feels that if he had said something nice to her that time, things would have been very different. And she wouldn't be having such a hard time right now. Is Luke Staton really sure this is all his fault? But at the same time, he stayed with her. But why would he take the ring off? Did he just change his mind and not want to miss his chance to be with her? The first thing he decided to do was to wet some cloth to put on her head, for that would prevent her headache. And when the girl started to come to her senses, she thought her mom or some relatives were taking care of her. But when she started to see everything around her, she realized who it was. This time, especially after she passed out, seeing a guy like that was very unexpected for her. And of course she was a little scared. Maybe she's just not used to the way he looks, and that's why she couldn't react calmly. How suddenly, after she had screamed and been frightened, Nadia accidentally fell from the bed, and when the assistants heard the sound of they went at once to her room. Nadia even thought she had dreamed it, for when the assistants came, there was no one in the room. The girls did not understand why Nadia was so frightened, or what she could be so frightened of, for they had heard a very loud scream from her room. They asked her if she had seen a stranger and was trying to call for help, to which she replied that she had just had a terrible dream, and because of this, she had fallen out of bed. When it turned out that nothing bad had happened, the girl was a little ashamed that because of her, the helpers had to get a little scared and run to the rescue, so she felt a little ashamed of her behavior. Nadia imagined the situation from the outside and thought she was acting like a little girl, but really there was no shame in it, for the helpers understood the situation perfectly well and were not going to laugh. In fact, they offered her something to eat or to do something they could help her with. But the girl only wanted them out of the room, and didn't see the frightened look on her face. Nadia immediately had thoughts that this was not how she had imagined the Duchess's life to be lived, but at the same time she was very grateful to her assistants, for they were still very good to her, and it had been a month since they had last come to her room. They bring her the most delicious treats every day. She really enjoys it when they help her and do everything they can to make her life as comfortable as possible. But still, Nadia didn't feel free. She constantly wanted to get back to the times when she had that. It just so happens she hasn't seen the Duke once in the last month, and that morning, she wasn't wearing the ring, and yet he had really taken it. I wondered if he'd just run away and never come back. The girl suspected something was wrong. Nadia keeps remembering how she fainted the first time she saw him, so she has a suspicion that maybe he's still mad at her for it. When the assistant starts to notice that the girl is always thinking about something and looks very sad, she decided to ask if something is bothering her, or if something bad has happened. But the girl replied that everything is fine, and thanked for her attentiveness. As she had not seen the Duke for a long time, the girl asked the assistant where she could find him, to which the assistant replied that he was now in his office, and also said that if it was necessary she could call on him. But Nadia thanked him for that, and said it was not necessary, and if she wished she would go to him herself. After that, Nadia was very afraid that the aide would still want to call the Duke in for Nadia to talk to him after a long time. So I hoped she wouldn't do that and obey her mistress after all. Nadia did not even know what to talk to him about, because she felt guilty before him, and did not imagine what this meeting might be like. Since she used to avoid and fear him a lot, the girl is sure he won't want to talk to her anymore. And most surprisingly, Nadia even considered writing to her parents asking them to help apologize to the Duke. But if she did, it could ruin their relationship, which she certainly didn't want to do. Meanwhile, it was already evening, and it seems that the girl had finally decided to act and correct all her mistakes that she had made before. And the first thing she decided to do was go to the Duke's office, and that's when she was spotted by his assistant. He immediately realized who this girl was, because she was the only one with blonde, wavy hair and a special appearance. And apparently she didn't want anyone to notice her, so she decided to hide and not draw attention to herself. But unfortunately she didn't. Apparently her disguise wasn't good enough. Nadia was spotted by the first passerby who saw her even in her disguise. When he started to ask where her assistants were, the girl answered that she didn't want to ask them for anything, so she went to write a letter to her friend. But in fact, Nadia tried to make her assistants think that she was asleep, when in fact she had run away to the Duke. But to explain the reason for her being near his room, Nadia said that as there were many rooms around here, she had gotten a little lost and had happened to be here by accident. But the Duke's aide still wondered why she needed to go out at night, and yet to do so in the place of an assistant. When he thought to offer her some assistance and guide her to the right place, he remembered the words of the Duke, who had forgiven to do anything she asked of him. So he did not wait for her request, and decided to offer to escort her to her room, as it was late, and it might be dangerous to go alone through unfamiliar corridors. But the girl insisted that he show her where there was a special room where she could send a letter to the... And of course he not only guided her, but stayed by her side to show her the way back afterward, so that the girl would not be lost, as she had been on the way here. It was very obvious to him that Nadia did not feel very comfortable in his presence, so in order to remedy the situation, he decided to ask her something. Namely, why she came without her assistance, because it's their job, and she shouldn't be thinking about how to make their job easier. But after that question, you have to be very nervous at first, because she had something to hide, because she had originally told him an untruth, and sticking to that wasn't easy. And once again, to make her less nervous, the guy says it's not really about the maid. He just thinks something's bothering her. Besides, he doesn't leave her alone in this room for a reason. In fact, he was asked by the Duke some time ago to keep an eye on her and do his best to make her comfortable here. It turns out that since the last time they had seen each other, Staten had decided not to visit her too often, and because of that, he had asked his assistant to keep an eye on her and tell him everything that was going on with her. He'd love to come to her every day, but unfortunately, he makes her too scared to see him, so he does it for her. When Nadia realized that he wasn't really angry with her, but wanted to do something good, she was very pleased, because she hadn't expected it, and she hadn't thought he would take care of her that way. They hadn't seen each other for a month, and in that time they had missed each other very much. Today, when Nadia had found out that he wasn't angry with her, she had more confidence that if she came over, they would be able to have a proper talk. From that point on, the girl really thought about the fact that maybe he wasn't as bad and scary as he seemed at first glance. She started to remember that he really hadn't done anything bad for her, and vice versa, constantly trying to ask her out or surprise her in some way, which she constantly avoided, because she looked at him like all the other people who are sure he's a very scary person. As suddenly, the Duke's assistant asked why she should not ask the Duke on a date. He would probably be very happy about it, and would definitely not refuse. But Nadia did not even think about it. Then, the guy decided to tell her that her new ring would be delivered soon, so it would be okay to pick it up and finally wear it. It turns out that the time he took her ring, it was for nothing, and he didn't really want to get away from her. The thing is, when he found out she had sensitive hands, he immediately ordered the ring to be redesigned specifically for her, so that she would like it a little more and be much more comfortable wearing it. It was now clear to her that he had done it to make her feel good about getting a ring that would be much better and prettier than the one she had before. But since Nadia is still in this room, and has already written a letter to her father, does she still wish to leave this palace and forget the Duke forever? She thought about the fact that she was an adult, and if she did that to him, she'd never know how he really felt about her. At this point, the guy did notice that she had decided something and made an important decision, so he decided to ask her what she was going to do next, to which the girl replied that she should do as he had suggested to her recently. And when he heard that, he certainly didn't expect Nadia to heed his advice. At some point, she made the decision not to send Nick a letter, but instead to try to patch things up with the Duke, because if she succeeded, she wouldn't want to go home again. As suddenly, Nadia asked him to escort her to the Duke, and she said it very confidently, as if she knew exactly what she would say to him when they started talking, though usually that was the problem. Meanwhile, Luke Staten was thinking the same thing, but unlike the girl, he wasn't sure of himself, and he had no idea if he had any chance of the girl wanting to talk to him. This time, he was more responsible, and made the decision that this time he had no chance of making a mistake, and if it didn't work out, it would be the last time he would try anything for their relationship. Since just recently his assistant had suggested one option, that they would meet casually in the hallway first, and that way they would be able to start talking after a whole month. But the Duke still doubted it, and was sure that even that wouldn't help him. It was the last decisive attempt, on which a great deal depended, but because of his insecurity, It was very difficult for him to make the first step. Luke Staton always collected the most accurate data and assessed his forces. But what strategy is needed this time? He had no idea. So he hoped only on the advice of his assistant, who, unlike him, was confident in his plan, and did not even doubt that thanks to this, the Duke would definitely succeed in everything. When the Duke started to get angry, at which time Nadia's assistant came up to him, who had never seen him in such a state before, so she was surprised that he could be like this. And when the Duke noticed her, he remembered that for some time he had asked her to invite some hairdresser who could make him a beautiful hairdo. But unfortunately, the assistant had not yet completed this task, because she could not find a suitable master. And this was very bad news, because there was less and less time left. So, Staton made a very unexpected decision. He would do his own hair, because he didn't want to wait for a barber anymore. And it seems that it would be really pointless, because in his town, there were very few of them. But to prevent this, the aide went to call his assistant, and asked that the Duke not draw premature conclusions and decisions. The woman felt very guilty because she didn't complete her task at the right time, and this could spoil his attitude towards her. The lad was alone, and he had a feeling of uneasiness, and it increased every day, for it had been a whole month since he had left Nadia alone. But he still had hope that if he changed his hair a little, she wouldn't be frightened of him anymore, and there would be a chance for a good relationship with her, for he certainly did not want to see her faint again, and her face lighten up because of it. But before he came in, he asked if Luke was comfortable talking right now. But since the Duke was waiting for him, he was ready to talk. But it turned out that the Duke was already waiting for him, and so he asked why it had taken him so long to come to him. The assistant promised to bring the Duke a new hairdresser, and as he still had not been there, the Duke was very angry, because he wanted as soon as possible to change his appearance for the better. But as it turned out, the assistant did not come alone. With him was Nadia. It so happened that the Duke did not immediately notice the girl, and was very surprised when he saw her, because he did not expect that she herself would want to come to him and talk to him. Luke Staton immediately started apologizing to her for shouting in her presence. He was embarrassed because once again, their meeting had not gone well. As suddenly, the girl for some reason decided to remind him that she was his wife. But what was the purpose? Had he not noticed or forgotten that they were married? Though perhaps she said this in order for him not to apologize to her, since the girl had long ago accepted his character and was used to it. After that they did go into his room, and the girl was looking at it. For this room was very different from her bedroom, but it was still very beautiful. But Nadia liked the brighter and cozier rooms. She found the setting a little gloomy and uncomfortable, but she tried not to show it. The Duke realized that she as a girl could not appreciate a man's room, for she liked something different from him, and their preferences were certainly different, so he suggested that they sit down and talk about something important, which the girl of course agreed to, because she came for this very purpose. And even in spite of the previous experience, it is surprising that the two of them decided to do this deed, and sincerely want to talk, although they are sure that it is not mutual. Nadia was very much worried and did not understand how to behave in this situation. But at the same time, the Duke also did not understand how best to start this conversation, because he had been waiting for it for so long, but unfortunately did not have time to prepare, because everything happened too unexpectedly. But in order to somehow remedy the situation, he had one very good option, but still the Duke was not completely sure of it, and doubted that the girl could refuse it. He offered her to drink one very tasty drink, and Nadia immediately agreed, although the guy was sure that she would definitely refuse it. Plus, she had never tasted this before, and had no idea how her body would react to it, or if she would even like the drink at all. As suddenly, Nadia was surprised by this taste and feeling. After tasting such a thing for the first time, Duke didn't expect such a reaction, and didn't understand if it was normal or not. But she seemed to be fine, and this reaction was because she was trying this drink for the first time. But the guy was waiting for her to at least make some comments when she would tell her feelings. But because of the excitement and fear that she might become ill, he offered to call someone for help, and also to get some ordinary water to improve the situation. But the girl replied that everything was all right, and she did not need any help. Nadia explained that she was actually just surprised, because it was really something new and unusual. Suddenly, something happened that the Duke could not have expected after what had happened. The girl decided to repeat, and drank some more of this drink. Apparently, she really liked it. When she had drunk it completely, Nadia was ready to talk, and began it first. She said she'd been thinking for days about going to him and having a normal conversation, and that they should have talked a long time ago, and realized what kind of relationship they were in, and if there were any problems, she was willing to try and do her best to make sure there were no more, because she was very ashamed of her behavior the day she ran away from him. The Duke was very surprised at these words, and didn't expect her to be the first to talk about it, and that it was really important to her, because he was sure it definitely wasn't. And he also said that she didn't have to apologize for anything. After this, the girl wondered whether, after the first time she had been frightened by him and had run away, he had not been angry with her, for it seemed to her that he would never forgive her again, or even want to talk to her. It turns out that the girl explained that at the time, she had been preparing for the wedding for a very long time, and she was very nervous about it. And when she saw a lot of guests, she was very scared, and it had nothing to do with how he looked like. So she decided to finally apologize to him for her behavior, and asked him, if possible, not to be mad at her, because she would try and work it out, and not act like this towards him again. The Duke replied that he had never actually been mad at her, and didn't understand where she got that from, or why she thought that. But the girl explained that a while ago, he hadn't wanted to see her, so she had drawn those conclusions. Luke Staton didn't know how to explain it to her, because he realized that she was very wrong, and in fact, he always treated her very well. But it would be very difficult to explain it, because she was sure of the contrary. As he moved away from her a little, Nadia became definitely sure of her words, and again mistakenly thought that he was very much tired of her and did not want to talk. But in fact the Duke was reflecting on the fact that there was a growing misunderstanding between them, and was thinking how to answer her to her words. After that, the girl asked him to answer honestly one very important question. Did he not want to see her all this time because he hated her, and yet she still tried to stop by to talk to him even though she didn't even know what to say? When he heard this question, he was very much surprised, for he had never thought that a girl could really be genuinely worried that he might have treated her badly and wanted to make it up to her. And of course, to change her mind forever, Luke Staton said that he never thought that, but instead tried to figure out the reason why they couldn't create a good relationship, and came up with a plan to fix it for good, so she can no longer even think about the fact that she was guilty of something or did something wrong. But the girl still tried to apologize, because she imagines how he was offended to realize that because of his appearance, they do not want to communicate with him or be in a relationship. After that, Nadia decided to ask if he regrets that he chose her as a wife, because so many people talk about how he didn't care what kind of bride he was going to have, what kind of name she was going to have, character, looks, and many other things that husbands usually care a lot about before choosing a bride for themselves. Nadia was sure that what mattered to him was the very fact of getting married, and so he simply proposed to the first girl he saw. And when the Duke found out about it, he just didn't expect that a lot of people were of that opinion, and that Nadia could believe it. So he immediately decided to explain everything to her so that she would never think like that again. I said so. He didn't choose her because she was the first person he saw, but because she's the only one he likes, and he doesn't need anyone else but her, because she's the most beautiful girl. And that's how he always imagined his wife to be. And of course Nadia had certainly not expected to hear such an answer from him, for she was sure that he had never loved her sincerely, and had married her only to have some bride. But still she wondered why he had left her alone then, and had not explained anything. He keeps saying he's not mad at her, and that she has nothing to apologize for, so she can't understand why he left after all, if things were so good and he really liked her so much. Nadia even contemplated that he would ask and suggest a divorce at some point, for she was sure that he didn't like something about her, to which the Duke replied that this was absolutely not the case, and he had never thought about it. Nadia replied that she wouldn't want that either, and wanted to keep their relationship intact. Then, in order to reassure his wife, the Duke tried to apologize for not having come to her all this time, and leaving her all alone for a long time. And after that, he finally explained the reason why they hadn't seen each other all this time. The thing was that he had always felt that Nadia was very much afraid of him, so he wanted to give her some time so that she could calm down and get used to him. Because really, he never even had any thoughts of doing something like that or proposing a divorce. And also, the Duke said he wasn't mad about anything, so she could be at peace and never think about it again. And if anyone should apologize, it's him. Luke Staton never wanted to make his wife upset or cry, and for that he felt very guilty. And when he touched her, at that moment the girl remembered a recent situation where she thought she had just dreamed that he was near her. So now she realized that it had not been a dream, and the Duke had indeed come to see her that day. But somehow, he had managed to make it so that no one noticed him. And even the girl had thought it was a dream. So Nadia decided to make sure of it, and still asked him a very important question to which she was anxious to have an answer, namely, whether he had come into her room, to which the Duke replied that it was only once that day when she was very ill and sick. He could not leave her alone in such a state, so he decided to control how the girl felt at that moment. Afterwards he decided to apologize to her, and hoped very much that Nadia would understand and forgive him. When the girl found out about it, she felt very pleased, and she realized that it was definitely not a dream. Nadia did not think that it was really very important for him to control his condition and be near at such a difficult moment for her. It was exactly the moment when she saw in him a real husband, who in any situation is capable of help and support. It turns out that he did even more than her assistants and doctors, and it was just amazing. He courted the girl, and came very often at a time when she did not see it and was asleep, and this was only so that she would not be frightened of him. But at the same time he could help her. After that, the Duke remembered something, and decided to talk to her about another very important topic. The fact is that Nadia never calls him by his name, and since they are already husband and wife, in his opinion, this should be corrected as soon as possible. So he asked her to call him Luke, because it would be easier and more correct for everyone, and the girl doesn't have to address him the same way as his assistants, because she has the right to address him by his name. But then the most interesting thing happened. As it was already too late, it was necessary to rest. So the Duke asked if the girl wanted to go to her room, as they had already discussed everything. You could go to rest. To which the girl replied that it wasn't necessary. I asked her again if she wanted to go to her room, to which she said she had to go back and she couldn't stay here, for they were married, and usually husband and wife slept in the same room. But this the Duke had certainly not expected, nor had he even thought that she might suggest it herself. Apparently after his words, the girl changed her opinion, and saw in him a real caring husband, which always dreamed of. So she asked if they should not be in the same bedroom after so long. Apparently Nadia trusts him now, if he offers such an option. Luke supposed that they would have to come to this point at some point, and this stage would come, but not as quickly as it happened today. And after all, a while ago, the guy was sure that the girl would not even want to talk to him. But in fact it turned out to be quite different. It sounds like they both want to be together, and even though they've made past mistakes and misunderstood situations, they're willing to make amends for the sake of being happy together. But first, he had something to do, for on the day when the girl thought it was a dream, he took the ring from her, for he wanted to make a little surprise to please her. So he reminded her of it, and asked her to wait a few minutes. But at this moment, the girl for some reason once again very much frightened, and even thought that he will ask him to return it, because the girl still does not know that he took it then. As suddenly, he says that he has a new ring for her, which is much better, prettier, and more comfortable. He explained that he did it only for her to wear it with pleasure and comfort, because he found out that the previous ring made her uncomfortable, so he decided to make such a small gift. And of course Nadia was very surprised, because she did not think that he was so attentive and caring. The girl probably didn't expect that during this time when they were talking. She would learn a lot of good things, hear nice things, and receive a gift like this, in the form of a new ring, which she didn't even ask for. It was very nice for her that he made this decision on his own. Noticed somehow that with the past, she was very uncomfortable, and took his time to find a new ring. It did look a lot better, but still despite that, it was all about being comfortable with it. And at that moment, when the Duke was putting the ring on her, the girl remembered the advice of his assistant, and realized that he was indeed right, which was very pleasant to realize at such a moment. Nadia only now realized that the Duke's assistant spent a lot of time with him, and when he advised something, it was definitely not just words. He knew what he was talking about, And the girl was not indifferent to him at all. When she starts to remember the relationship she had with him before, she finds it hard to believe that at this point, things have changed so much. She's not afraid of him anymore, and she knows for sure that he really loves her. At the moment, Nadia is sure that she doesn't have to be afraid of him anymore, and that with him, she will be the happiest wife, because he is a very attentive, caring, and loving husband who will always be able to protect her and make her happy. And apparently the girl was too tired, and it was obvious how she wanted to rest after such a hard day and an important conversation with the Duke, on which she had spent a lot of energy. When her husband asked if she was all right, the girl replied that she was anxious to rest, as the day had been too eventful and unusual. So she went straight to his bed without even thinking, to rest a little, for she thought she would feel better afterward. But the Duke was very surprised, and did not know what to do in this situation. His wife lay down on the bed, so it was necessary to quickly think of what to do in this situation. The first option, to say goodnight and go out. The second option, just lie down next to him. But this choice had to be made in such a way as not to create unnecessary problems for the morning. But the guy did not even suspect that the situation will be so that he will not have to make such a difficult choice, because the girl will do everything herself. She asked him at one point if he was still not tired and would not like to rest, for it was too late, and they had already discussed everything that was needed. So Nadia offered to lie down beside him, which he had not expected, because he had not thought that she could offer him that after only one conversation, if she really was not afraid of him anymore, and trusted her husband, despite what had happened before. To which the Duke replied that they need not sleep in the same room just because they were married, for it might not be right of him to do so to her. The girl tried to talk him into it, for she saw nothing wrong with it, though perhaps she would not have suggested it if she had not been so tired. To somehow explain why this was important to her, the girl said that in an unfamiliar room, it will be scary and uncomfortable to sleep alone without the presence of your husband, with whom these problems will not be, if he agrees and does not refuse, of course. As suddenly to clarify the situation a little, and they understood each other correctly, and the Duke decided to ask if she knew what usually happens for a wife and husband after marriage in such situations, to which the girl replied that of course she knew everything perfectly well, and that there was nothing wrong in it. Besides, she had less and less strength to talk, for she was too tired. The Duke is anxious to hear what she has to say, because so much depends on it. And when Nadia was ready to answer, it seemed to him as if the time had lasted for hours, for he had been waiting for it very much for her to answer at last. And at last Nadia was ready, and she told him that usually after the wedding a husband and wife hug for a long time, and after that, rested. And when he hears it, for some reason he gets very nervous, because it's been a very difficult subject for him. He was already thinking of different answers and how to react. Well, when the girl started asking if he was okay, he said he was fine, just very, very tired because this day was really very intense and unusual. To which the girl replied that he'd feel much better after he got some sleep and strength, and afterward asked if he would send her back to her room, to which the Duke replied that of course not, she could stay and rest. Before going to bed, he was so much worried and afraid of doing something wrong that he began to blame himself, for he began to think of something he was ashamed of. He was having some bad thoughts, and hoped not that the girl was hinting at what he was thinking after all, but that turned out not to be the case. So, he was embarrassed that he could think about it. As they lay side by side, it was very hard for the Duke to sleep, for there was such a beautiful girl lying beside him, and she was also his wife. And to distract himself and go to sleep, he began to remember some tunes and think of something else, for it was really hard for him to ignore her and go to sleep in peace. It was hard for him to do so, but he had to hold on, so as not to frighten her and ruin everything they had come to through conversation. And yet he had succeeded. The next morning when the girl awoke, she had not at all noticed that the Duke had gone somewhere and she was alone. When Nadia realized that he had definitely gone somewhere, she wondered very much for what reason, for she hoped that he really had some business to attend to, and not because he didn't want to be near her. But most importantly, Nadia remembered perfectly well that he had cuddled her before going to bed, and they had fallen asleep together. And since they were now husband and wife that evening, he asked her to call him by his name, which was not surprising, for they had really known each other for months, and were married. So it was strange that the girl still called him specially, not by his name, as a wife ought to do. Some more time. She lay on the bed, and was glad that they had at last discussed everything, and that there were no longer any misunderstandings between them which interfered with their happy life. It was very unusual for her to realize everything that was happening, because they had new responsibilities to each other, which they had to fulfill, so that their relationship would not have problems and misunderstandings, as it was originally. The girl realized that it turns out that any problem can be solved through conversation. Making the first step is sometimes necessary in order to fix something as soon as possible and to establish relations. Of all the men, she was only close to her friend James and her brother Anderson, and as the youngest, she was constantly cared for and given a lot of attention. Sometimes, it was even too much. So, she was not ready for such unexpected changes in her life, but still the girl was sure that it was all for the best, and she would be happy with this man, because he's really trying to make them feel good and make the girl feel happy, and every time she starts to fall in love with him more and more, because judging by his actions, he also loves her very much, and is ready to do everything possible to make her smile and not regret that she agreed to become his wife. As suddenly, when the assistants made sure that the girl was already awake, they immediately went to her room, or rather to the Duke's room. But she had not yet had time to wake up, and had not even gotten out of bed, so she was not ready to greet anyone. But still the helpers brought her a very tasty breakfast. But when they asked her if she would have breakfast now, the girl asked them to bring it after she had washed her face and cleaned herself up. As suddenly, Nadia remembers that yesterday she had done a little wrong to them, so that they thought that the girl was at home, and in fact had not gone anywhere, and at that moment, she was in the Duke's room, so she was uncomfortable and a little ashamed of her act in front of them. A little time passed, and the helpers finally brought a very delicious breakfast for her. Besides, she was really very hungry, and was really looking forward to this moment to drink hot tea and enjoy the moment. When they asked the girl how she felt, she didn't know what to say at first, because she felt guilty. But she answered and said that she had had a good night's sleep, so she felt fine, and thanked them for their concern. One of the assistants decided to ask her something, why Nadia had run away yesterday, and she didn't tell them anything, because she had heard that she had spent all that time with the Duke. But the other assistant felt very uncomfortable that Wendy had allowed herself to ask such a question, for which the girl of course apologized, and said that in fact she was going to go back to her room yesterday. But it turned out that she fell asleep, and could not return, because she was too tired. One of the assistants asked if she was too scared in an unfamiliar room, to which Nadia replied that this was not a problem, as her husband was with her, so she was not afraid of anything. As suddenly, that girl asked what else was interesting. But the second assistant started to feel even more awkward, and tried to let her know that she had no right to ask such a thing, because it was none of her business. So the assistant asked the girl to finish her breakfast, because it might get cold and not be as appetizing.